Throughout history, societies have repeatedly made the same financial mistakes without fully realizing it. Each time the context changed, the tools evolved, and the language became more complex. Yet the core error always remained the same: confusing short-term comfort with long-term stability. From ancient civilizations to modern economies, financial collapses rarely occurred because people lacked intelligence. On the contrary, they were driven by underestimated risks, ignored warnings, and excessive trust in systems that appeared stable on the surface. Empires were not destroyed by wars alone. Many collapsed because they debased their currencies, spent beyond their productive capacity, or accumulated massive debt under the belief that growth would last forever. What made these mistakes especially dangerous was that, at the moment they were made, they often seemed reasonable. Leaders defended them as temporary solutions. Citizens accepted them as necessary sacrifices, and markets rewarded them in the short term. Financial reality, however, is patient. It does not punish immediately. Instead, it waits until dependency deepens. Safety buffers disappear, and alternatives are exhausted. Then the correction arrives suddenly and brutally. This cycle repeats itself again and again. Excessive debt replaces sustainable income. Speculation replaces production, and optimism replaces discipline. Over time, warning signs become normalized. Rising prices are dismissed. Declining purchasing power is blamed on external forces, and structural weaknesses are ignored. The greatest financial mistakes are never accidents. They are collective decisions reinforced by comfort, fear, and delayed consequences. Understanding this pattern is the first step, because before societies collapse financially, they almost always convince themselves that this time is different. As economies expanded and societies grew more complex, debt slowly transformed from an emergency tool into a permanent solution. What initially existed to bridge temporary gaps began to replace sustainable income over time. Governments realized that borrowing allowed them to postpone difficult decisions, and this became incredibly convenient. Corporations learned that leverage could fuel rapid growth without immediate cost, while individuals were encouraged to spend tomorrow's income today. At first glance, this shift appeared harmless, even beneficial. Infrastructure was built, consumption increased, and the illusion of shared prosperity spread. Yet beneath the surface, a structural imbalance was quietly forming. Debt did not disappear once money was spent. Instead, it accumulated silently. Every borrowed unit created a future obligation, narrowing flexibility and reducing room to maneuver. Over time, entire systems became dependent on continuous borrowing just to maintain normal operations. Growth was no longer required to advance, but simply to service existing obligations. This marked one of the greatest financial mistakes in history: the assumption that future growth would always compensate for present excesses. When growth slowed or external shocks occurred, the illusion collapsed. Budgets tightened overnight, interest burdens exploded, and trust evaporated. What made this mistake especially destructive was how slowly and invisibly it progressed. The sense of crisis did not emerge until it was already too late. Debt normalized risk, concealed fragility, and created the belief that stability could last indefinitely. In reality, debt-based financial systems are not resilient. They are extremely sensitive. Once confidence weakens, the entire structure begins to shake. Over time, one of the greatest financial mistakes begins to reveal itself: the normalization of debt. When societies start treating debt as a routine solution rather than a temporary tool, boundaries quietly disappear. Governments cover deficits with borrowing. Corporations finance expansion through debt. And individuals sustain their lifestyles by relying on borrowed money. At first, this creates a sense of relief, but it is only temporary. Spending increases, growth figures appear stronger, and an illusion of progress takes hold. Everyone believes the system is working. Yet this growth is not rooted in productivity. It is built on future income. Today's comfort is effectively purchased at the expense of tomorrow's burden. In this process, debt stops being a financial choice and becomes a force that shapes behavior. Those who are indebted act more cautiously, avoid risk, and cling more tightly to the existing system because they have more to lose. On a societal level, this produces a structure that is compliant and resistant to change. While the economy appears to grow, fragility expands at the same pace. Even the smallest shock can trigger a chain reaction. The true fracture begins when the cost of debt becomes visible. Interest rates rise, repayment pressures increase, and budgets tighten. What was once considered normal debt suddenly turns into a source of stress. Governments turn to austerity, companies downsize, and individuals lose purchasing power. By that point, however, options are already limited. Debt has increased dependency, not flexibility. This is why many financial collapses throughout history are not sudden. They accumulate slowly, warnings are ignored, risks are postponed, and debt continues to be presented as a solution until the system can no longer carry its own weight. The core truth is simple. When debt becomes normalized, collapse becomes inevitable. Debt borrows time, and when that time runs out, the cost is always paid. The next stage of major financial mistakes emerges when the value of money is eroded, whether deliberately or unintentionally. Throughout history, many societies have chosen the easiest path to relieve the pressure created by debt and excessive spending, increasing the money supply. At first glance, this approach appears to reduce pain. Governments take a temporary breath, debts seem more manageable on paper, and markets experience short-lived stimulation. But the value of money does not rest solely on its quantity. It survives on trust. When that trust is damaged, the foundation of the entire economic order begins to shake. Once people stop believing that money will hold the same value tomorrow, behavior changes, spending accelerates, savings decline, and individuals rush to convert their money into something they perceive as real. Inflation, at this stage, is not merely rising prices. It is the visible expression of lost confidence. Wages fail to keep up, purchasing power erodes, and society becomes quietly poorer. Even more dangerous is how this process is often normalized. Price increases are labeled temporary. Responsibility is shifted to external factors, and structural problems are ignored. Yet as money loses value, not only the economy weakens, social trust erodes as well. When people feel their labor no longer yields fair returns, their sense of justice deteriorates. Respect for rules declines. Short-term self-interest takes priority, and social cohesion begins to fracture. Many historic collapses accelerated precisely at this stage. Because once money loses credibility, restoring it becomes extraordinarily difficult. What truly disappears when money loses value is not paper or numbers, but faith in the system itself. And when that faith collapses, financial mistakes approach a point of no return. One of the most persistent and dangerous financial mistakes is the gradual normalization of debt as a way of life. At first, debt is presented as a temporary solution, a way to survive a difficult period, finance an investment, or accelerate growth. But this temporary state often evolves into a permanent structure. As governments, corporations, and individuals grow accustomed to living with debt, borrowing stops being an exception and becomes the very foundation that keeps the system running. At this stage, the question is no longer, should we borrow? But how much more can we borrow? Future income is spent today, and value that has not yet been produced is consumed for present comfort. In the short term, this feels relieving because pain is postponed. But every postponed problem returns later with a much heavier cost. As debt increases, freedom of movement shrinks. Decisions are no longer made freely but are dictated by obligations. The expectations of creditors begin to outweigh the priorities of borrowers. For individuals, this means years of dependency. People choose jobs not based on passion or purpose, but on their ability to service debt. They avoid risk and settle for safe but unfulfilling paths. On a societal level, debt turns into a silent discipline mechanism. Indebted populations fear uncertainty, resist change, and prefer the continuation of the existing order, because change carries the risk of default. For this reason, debt is not merely an economic tool, it is a force that shapes behavior. Its most dangerous aspect is its moral and psychological normalization. Living without debt is seen as unrealistic, while those who avoid borrowing are viewed as outdated or irresponsible. As a result, the future is continuously mortgaged while today's problems are normalized. History has shown repeatedly that no system built on debt can survive indefinitely, because at some point, the future will be fully consumed. And when the future is gone, there will be no tools left to save the present. When we look from the past to the present, it becomes clear that the greatest financial mistakes are rarely made by accident. These errors usually stem not from a lack of knowledge, but from human nature and the illusions created by systems themselves. When short-term gains are prioritized over long-term risks, rational thinking is pushed aside. Comfort replaces discipline, and hope covers uncomfortable truths. During periods when things appear to be going well, individuals and institutions begin to see pushing boundaries as success. Warnings feel disruptive and precautions seem unnecessary. Yet history shows that financial systems reach their most fragile state precisely when they appear strongest. As bubbles inflate, no one wants to talk about collapse. Problems are postponed, risks are ignored, and responsibility is shifted into the future until the point where turning back is no longer possible. At that stage, the cost is severe, and it is rarely paid by those who made the decisions. Instead, it is borne by those who must live with the consequences. This is why financial mistakes repeat themselves. Systems may evolve, but human greed, fear, and attachment to comfort remain unchanged. Each generation believes it understands the traps that caught the previous one. Yet when similar conditions emerge, the same instincts resurface. "This time is different" is the most common phrase heard before every collapse. The real lesson is this: financial stability requires patience more than intelligence, balance more than growth, and sustainability more than speed. The greatest mistakes of the past teach us that the problem is not money, technology, or market tools. The problem is forgetting limits and believing in the illusion of effortless gains. This cycle can only be broken when societies learn to openly discuss risk, develop economic awareness, and choose long-term realities over short-term comfort. Otherwise, history will continue to repeat itself, using different names, different tools, but making the very same mistakes again and again.